She was not supposed to hear the words, but they reached her anyway, slipping through the crack in the dining room door like poison seeping under a locked door. The Duke married her out of obligation, nothing more. Lady Ashworth's voice was smooth, sympathetic, and perfectly cruel. It was the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to cut without drawing blood. Elara stood just outside the door, her hand frozen halfway toward the carved wood. Her heart had stopped the moment she heard her own name spoken with such pity. "She is lovely, I suppose," another voice added. Lady Pemberton this time, her tone dripping with false kindness. In a quiet sort of way, but one cannot blame His Grace for still grieving. After Lady Cecily, well, a replacement can never truly fill the original's place, can she? Replacement. The word landed in Elara's chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, cold and undeniable. She had been married to Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Thornwood, for exactly 1 year. 1 year of silent breakfasts, 1 year of separate bedrooms, 1 year of waiting for him to look at her with something other than polite indifference. 1 year of being invisible. She pulled her hand back from the door. Her fingers were trembling. For a long moment she simply stood there, listening to the low murmur of voices inside, the occasional soft laugh, the clink of teacups against saucers. She was the Duchess of Thornwood, and she had not been invited to tea in her own home. The realization should not have stung so sharply. After 12 months of marriage, she should have grown accustomed to being overlooked. But somehow, the pain never dulled. It simply found new ways to wound her. Elara turned away from the door and walked down the corridor. Her slippers made no sound on the polished marble floors. She had learned to move silently through this house, to take up as little space as possible, to exist without disturbing the delicate balance of a household that had never truly accepted her presence. She had been 19 when her father told her about the arrangement. The Duke of Thornwood needed a wife to secure an alliance between their families. Her father needed the political protection that came with such a match. It was a transaction, nothing more. But Elara had been young enough to hope. She had stood at the altar in her mother's wedding gown, her hands steady, her heart full of quiet dreams. When Alexander lifted her veil, she had looked into his gray eyes and thought, perhaps he will learn to love me. Perhaps I can make him happy. She had been a fool. Alexander Ashworth was still in love with a ghost. Lady Cecily Fairfax had died 4 years before Elara ever set foot in Thornwood Hall. She had been beautiful, accomplished, and adored by everyone who knew her. The daughter of an earl, raised to be a duchess. She and Alexander had grown up together. Their families had always assumed they would marry. And then fever took her. The entire county mourned, Alexander most of all. Elara had known about Lady Cecily before she married him. Everyone knew. The tragic love story was woven into the fabric of local society, retold in hushed voices at every gathering, painted in broad strokes of romantic sorrow. But knowing a thing and living in its shadow were 2 entirely different experiences. She had entered Thornwood Hall as a bride, full of quiet determination. She would be patient. She would be kind. She would prove herself worthy of his affection through grace and devotion. She had not realized that she was competing with a memory, and memories, she had learned, could not be defeated. Elara reached the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor. It was the one room in the vast estate that had become hers by default, a quiet space with faded rose wallpaper and a window that overlooked the gardens. No one else used it. No one else wanted it. She closed the door behind her and stood very still. The silence pressed against her ears. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the first months of her marriage, silent tears shed into her pillow in the darkness of her separate bedroom. She had no tears left for this moment. Instead, something else stirred inside her chest, something quiet and cold and unfamiliar. Resignation. She could not spend the rest of her life waiting for a man who would never see her. She could not wither away in this beautiful cage, growing old and bitter, while Alexander Ashworth mourned a woman he had lost years ago. Something had to change. She just did not yet know what that change would look like. The dinner bell rang at 7 o'clock, as it always did. The sound echoed through the corridors of Thornwood Hall like a summons to an event that Alara had come to dread. She dressed carefully, as she always did, a gown of deep blue silk, simple but elegant. Her dark hair was pinned up with pearl combs that had belonged to her grandmother. She studied her reflection in the mirror and saw a young woman who looked far older than 20 years. Her eyes were too serious, her smile too rare. She made her way to the dining room, her heart heavy with the memory of the words she had overheard that afternoon. But when she pushed open the door, she stopped short. The long mahogany table stretched before her, set with crystal and silver and candlelight. But the seating arrangement had changed. Alexander sat not at the head of the table where he had always sat, but halfway down one side. His chair had been moved, and beside him, in the seat that had once belonged to Alara, sat Lady Cecily's younger sister. Lady Marguerite Fairfax was everything Alara was not. She was vivacious where Alara was reserved. She was golden-haired where Alara was dark. She laughed easily and spoke with the confidence of a woman who had never been made to feel small. And she had the same gray-blue eyes as her dead sister. Alara had known this, of course. She had noticed the resemblance the first time she met Marguerite 6 months ago, when the young woman had arrived for what was supposed to be a brief visit. The visit had stretched into weeks, then months. No one spoke of her departure anymore. Now Marguerite sat beside Alexander, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve, her head tilted toward him as she murmured something that made the corner of his mouth lift. It was the smallest expression, barely a smile, but Alara's heart cracked at the sight of it. She had never made him smile, not once in an entire year. She stood frozen in the doorway, invisible to the pair at the table. Neither of them had noticed her arrival. The servants moved quietly around the room, their eyes carefully averted. Everyone in this house had learned to pretend that the Duchess did not matter. Alara took a breath, then another. She could turn around and leave. She could retreat to her small sitting room and take her dinner there alone. No one would notice her absence. No one would care. But something in her refused to break. Not here, not now. She walked to the table and took her seat at the far end, where she had been placed ever since Marguerite's arrival. The distance between her and her husband stretched the length of the table, a vast expanse of polished wood and flickering candlelight. Alexander did not look up. Marguerite did, briefly. Her gaze flicked to Alara with something that might have been pity or satisfaction. It was impossible to tell. Then she turned back to Alexander and resumed her quiet conversation. Dinner was served. Course after course arrived, each dish more exquisite than the last. Alara ate in silence, her movements mechanical. The food tasted like ash. Halfway through the meal, Marguerite laughed at something Alexander said. The sound was bright and musical, filling the cavernous dining room with warmth that Alara could not share. She set down her fork. She had spent a year trying to earn her place at this table. A year of quiet patience, of uncomplaining endurance, of hoping that one day her husband would turn his gaze toward her and truly see her. But he never did. And sitting here, at the far end of the table, watching him lean closer to another woman, Alara finally understood the truth she had been running from since the day she arrived at Thornwood Hall. She was not his wife, not truly. She was a name on a marriage contract, a signature on a document, a political convenience dressed in silk and pearls. The realization settled over her like a shroud. She waited until the final course was cleared. Then she rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. Alexander still did not look at her. Neither did Marguerite. Alara walked out of the dining room and did not look back. The days that followed passed in a blur of gray sameness. Alara withdrew further into herself, moving through the halls of Thornwood like a ghost. She stopped attending meals in the dining room. She stopped waiting for Alexander to acknowledge her presence. She stopped hopping. Instead, she began to wander. The estate was vast, thousands of acres of rolling hills, ancient woodlands, and tenant farms that stretched to the horizon. Alara had never explored it properly. As a new bride, she had been too busy trying to learn the rhythms of the household, too anxious about making mistakes, too focused on pleasing a husband who refused to be pleased. Now she had no such concerns. She took to walking every morning, leaving the house just after dawn and returning only when the sun began to dip toward the western hills. She walked until her legs ached and her lungs burned with cold air. She walked until her mind went quiet. It was on one of these walks, 3 weeks after the dinner that had broken something inside her, that she first met Thomas Hayward. He was the estate's physician, a young man with kind eyes and steady hands who had been brought to Thornwood 2 years ago to care for the tenants and servants. Alara had seen him in passing, nodded to him at church, exchanged brief pleasantries. She had never truly spoken to him. That changed on a gray afternoon in late autumn. She had been walking along the edge of the East Wood when she heard a child crying. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade, raw and desperate. Alara followed it without thinking, pushing through brambles and low-hanging branches until she found a small cottage tucked into a clearing. A woman stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear. In her arms she held a child, a boy of perhaps 4 years, his face flushed with fever, his small body limp. "Please," the woman whispered when she saw Alara, "please, my son." Alara did not hesitate. She stepped forward and pressed her hand to the child's forehead. The heat that met her palm made her stomach clench. "I will get help," she said. "Stay here, keep him warm." She ran. She ran through the woods, her skirts catching on branches, her lungs straining. She ran until she reached the main house and burst through the servants' entrance, startling a maid who dropped her basket of linens with a shriek. "Dr. Hayward," Alara gasped. "Where is Dr. Hayward?" She found him in his small office near the stables, organizing bottles of medicine. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Your Grace, what has happened?" "There is a child," she said, still struggling for breath. "In the East Wood, a fever, he needs help." Thomas did not ask questions. He grabbed his bag and followed her. Together, they made their way back through the woods. The walk that had felt like an eternity to Alara passed in what seemed like minutes with Thomas beside her, his long strides eating up the ground, his expression focused and calm. When they reached the cottage, the mother was weeping. The child had grown worse, his breathing shallow, his skin burning. Thomas knelt beside him and began to work with quiet efficiency. Alara stayed. She did not know why. She could have returned to the house, could have left the situation in the doctor's capable hands. But something kept her there, standing in the dim cottage, watching Thomas fight for the child's life. She helped where she could, fetching water, holding the boy's hand, murmuring soothing words to the terrified mother. She had never done anything like this before. Her life had been one of drawing rooms and dinner parties and carefully maintained appearances. She had never held a sick child. She had never felt so useful. Hours passed. The light outside the cottage windows faded from gray to gold to deep blue. And finally, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the boy's fever broke. Thomas sat back on his heels, his face exhausted but relieved. "He will recover," he said quietly. "He needs rest and fluids, but the worst has passed." The mother collapsed into tears of gratitude. Alara felt her own eyes sting. She and Thomas walked back to the main house together in the darkness. The night was cold and still, the silence broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the frozen ground. "You did well today, Your Grace," Thomas said eventually. His voice was low, meant only for her. Alara shook her head. "I did nothing, you saved him." "You found him," he corrected gently. "You came for help, you stayed. That is not nothing." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. Respect. The realization made her breath catch. "Thank you," she whispered. He inclined his head. "Good night, Your Grace." She watched him walk away toward the stables, his figure swallowed by the darkness. And for the first time in months, she felt something other than numbness. She felt seen. The weeks that followed brought more changes. Alara began to accompany Thomas on his visits to the tenant families. At first, she simply observed, watching as he treated illnesses and injuries with the same quiet competence she had witnessed in the cottage. But soon she began to help, fetching supplies, holding bandages, comforting frightened children while their wounds were cleaned and stitched. She discovered that she had a gift for it. Her quiet nature, which had always been seen as a weakness in the glittering social world of the aristocracy, became a strength among the tenants. She listened without judgment. She offered comfort without empty platitudes. She remembered names and faces and stories. The tenants began to trust her. They called her the kind Duchess, and the name spread from cottage to cottage, farm to farm. Soon, people began to seek her out specifically, asking for her help with problems large and small. Alara threw herself into the work. It gave her purpose. It filled the empty hours that had once been devoted to waiting and hopping and being disappointed. She rose early and returned late, her hands busy, her heart occupied. She stopped attending meals in the dining room entirely. She stopped wearing her finest gowns. She stopped caring whether Alexander noticed her absence. And for a long time, he did not. The first sign that something had shifted came on a cold evening in December. Alara had spent the day in the village, helping to organize a winter relief effort for families struggling with the harsh weather. She returned to Thornwood Hall exhausted but satisfied, her mind already planning the next day's tasks. She was climbing the grand staircase when a voice stopped her. "Ilara." She froze. Her name, spoken in that deep, familiar voice, sent a jolt through her body. She turned slowly. Alexander stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her. His expression was unreadable, as it always was, but there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before. Curiosity. "You missed dinner," he said. Ilara blinked. "I was occupied." "So I have heard." Silence stretched between them. It was the longest conversation they had exchanged in weeks. "The steward tells me you have been visiting the tenants," Alexander said, "personally." "Yes." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. She considered it for a moment, searching for the right words. "Because they needed help," she said finally, "and I needed purpose." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your purpose is here, as Duchess of Thornwood." "My purpose," Alara said quietly, "is whatever I choose to make it." She turned and continued up the stairs, her heart pounding. She did not look back, but she could feel his gaze on her until she disappeared from view. The encounter left her unsettled. She had grown accustomed to his indifference. His attention, unexpected and intense, felt like a spotlight suddenly directed at someone who had learned to live in shadows. She did not know what it meant. She was not sure she wanted to find out. December deepened into January, and the winter grew bitter. Snow blanketed the estate, turning the landscape into a silent white expanse. The cold kept most people indoors, but Alara continued her visits to the tenants, wrapped in her warmest cloak and driven in a sleigh by one of the grooms. Thomas often accompanied her. Their friendship had deepened over the months, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. He never treated her as a duchess, only as a capable woman with a kind heart. and she found herself looking forward to his company in a way that she did not dare examine too closely. One afternoon, as they returned from a particularly difficult visit to a family who had lost their home to a fire, Thomas turned to her with an expression she could not read. "You are different from what I expected," he said. Elara raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "Someone more like the other ladies who visit the estate. Elegant and distant and entirely uninterested in the lives of ordinary people." She smiled faintly. "I am ordinary people. Before I married Alexander, my family was respectable but not wealthy. My father was a baron with more land than money. I know what it is to worry about a harvest." Thomas nodded slowly. "That explains a great deal." "Does it?" "It explains why you care." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "And why you deserve far more than you have received." The words hung in the cold air between them. Elara felt her cheeks flush, though whether from the cold or something else she could not say. "I do not need more," she said softly. "I have found what I need." Thomas did not respond, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. The change in Alexander became more pronounced as winter wore on. He began to notice Elara's absences. He began to ask questions of the servants. He began to appear in doorways as she passed, his gray eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She did not understand it. For a year, he had treated her as invisible. Now he watched her as though she were a puzzle he could not solve. The tension between them grew, stretched thin and taut like a wire pulled too tight. And then, one evening in late January, it snapped. Elara had returned from the village later than usual. She was tired and cold, her cloak damp with melting snow, her hair escaping from its pins. She was making her way toward her small sitting room when a hand closed around her arm. She gasped and spun around. Alexander stood behind her, his expression dark, his grip firm but not painful. He was close, closer than he had ever been. She could smell the faint scent of brandy on his breath, could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "Where have you been?" His voice was low and rough. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I was in the village, helping with the winter relief." "With the physician?" It was not a question. She lifted her chin. "Dr. Hayward accompanies me on many of my visits. The tenants trust him." "And you trust him?" Alexander's eyes burned. "You spend hours with him every day. The servants talk, the tenants talk, everyone talks." Elara pulled her arm free from his grip. Her fear was giving way to something else now, anger, hot and sharp. "You have ignored me for an entire year," she said, her voice trembling with the force of her emotion. "You moved another woman into my seat at the dinner table. You have never once looked at me as though I mattered. And now you presume to question my conduct." Alexander flinched. It was a tiny movement, barely visible, but Elara saw it. "I have not ignored you," he said. "You have not seen me," she corrected. "There is a difference." She stepped back, putting distance between them. Her whole body was shaking. "I am not your possession, Alexander. I am not a piece of furniture to be arranged and ignored and only noticed when someone else shows interest. I am your wife, and I have spent a year trying to be worthy of that title, but I cannot force you to love me. I cannot make you see me, so I have stopped trying." The words hung in the air between them, raw and undeniable. Alexander said nothing. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something that looked almost like pain. Elara turned and walked away. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation over and over in her mind. She had spoken truths she had kept buried for months. She had laid her heart bare before a man who had never cared enough to look at it. And she did not regret it. Whatever happened now, she was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. She had found her voice, and she would not lose it again. The morning brought no resolution. Alexander did not seek her out. She did not seek him. The house settled back into its uneasy rhythm, the tension between them simmering just beneath the surface. But something had shifted. Everyone could feel it. The servants whispered. Marguerite watched Alara with narrowed eyes. The air in Thornwood Hall felt charged, electric, as though a storm was gathering. And then, 3 days after their confrontation, Alexander appeared in the doorway of Alara's sitting room. She looked up from her book, her heart seizing in her chest. He stood motionless, his face shadowed, his hands clasped behind his back. "May I come in?" She nodded slowly. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. His gray eyes traced the lines of her face as though seeing her for the first time. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, "and an apology." Alara waited. Alexander exhaled, a long, unsteady breath. "When Cecily died, I thought I would never recover. She was part of my life for as long as I could remember. I loved her. I had always assumed I would marry her. And then she was gone, and I was left with nothing but a title and an estate and a future that felt empty." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. "When your father proposed the alliance, I agreed because it made political sense. I told myself that I could be a husband in name only, that I could fulfill my duty without risking my heart. I did not want to love again. I was afraid too." Alara's throat tightened. She had known this, of course. She had known from the beginning that he was still in love with a ghost, but hearing him speak the words aloud was different. It made the truth both sharper and somehow softer. "I was cruel to you," Alexander continued. "Not with words or actions, but with absence. I made you invisible because it was easier than seeing you. Because seeing you meant acknowledging that you were real and present and deserving of more than I was willing to give." He looked up, meeting her eyes. His own were bright with something that might have been tears. "I have watched you these past months. I have seen the way you care for the tenants, the way you throw yourself into work that most duchesses would consider beneath them. I have seen your strength and your kindness and your quiet courage, and I have realized that I have been blind." Ilara's breath caught. "I do not expect your forgiveness," he said. "I do not deserve it, but I need you to know that I see you now. I see you, Ilara, and I am so desperately sorry that it took me this long." The silence that followed was vast and fragile. Ilara looked at her husband, this man who had been a stranger for an entire year, this man who had broken her heart without ever raising his voice or lifting a hand. She looked at him and saw not a duke or a figure of authority, but a man, flawed and frightened and finally honest. "I do not know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "Not yet. The hurt is still too fresh." Pain flickered across Alexander's face, but he nodded. "But I hear you," she continued, "and that is more than you have ever given me before." Hope kindled in his gray eyes. It was a fragile thing, barely a spark, but it was there. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat together in the quiet room, the distance between them still vast but no longer insurmountable. And for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood Hall, Ilara felt something that she had almost forgotten existed. Possibility. The weeks that followed were strange and tentative. Alexander did not push. He did not demand her forgiveness or her affection. Instead, he simply showed up. He appeared in the mornings with small gestures, a cup of tea prepared the way she liked it, a book he thought she might enjoy, a single flower from the greenhouse placed on the table beside her chair. He began to ask about her work with the tenants, listening with genuine interest as she described the families she visited and the challenges they faced. He even accompanied her on some of her visits. The first time he joined her, the tenants were stunned. The Duke of Thornwood, who had always been a distant and intimidating figure, walking through the snow to check on a farmer's sick child. But Alexander did not seem to notice their shock. He knelt beside the child's bed and spoke to the parents with a gentleness that Ilara had never seen in him before. Afterward, as they walked back to the sleigh, he turned to her with a strange expression. "I have been a poor steward of these people," he said quietly. "I have been so lost in my own grief that I forgot my duty to them." Alara looked at him, her heart aching. "It is not too late to change." "No," he agreed. "Thanks to you, it is not too late." Something shifted between them in that moment. A wall that had stood for more than a year began to crumble. But healing was not a straight path. It twisted and turned, and sometimes doubled back on itself. And there were still shadows lurking in the corners of Thornwood Hall. Marguerite was one of those shadows. She had watched the growing closeness between Alexander and Alara with barely concealed resentment. Her place in the household, once so secure, had become uncertain. Alexander no longer sought her company. He no longer smiled at her jokes or leaned close to hear her whispers. She was being replaced, and she did not intend to go quietly. The confrontation came on a late February evening, when Alara was alone in the library, reading by the fire. Marguerite entered without knocking, her face tight with anger. "You think you have won," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You think you have taken him from me." Alara looked up from her book, her expression calm. "I have taken nothing. Alexander is my husband. He has always been my husband." "He loved my sister," Marguerite spat. "He loved Cecily. You are nothing but a political convenience." The words were meant to wound, and once they would have. But Alara had heard them before, in the whispered conversation that had nearly broken her months ago. She had built armor since then. "He did love your sister," Alara said quietly. "I have never denied that, but Cecily is dead, Marguerite. She has been dead for years, and clinging to her memory will not bring her back." Marguerite's face went pale. "You have no right." "I have every right," Alara interrupted. Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "I am the Duchess of Thornwood. This is my home, and I will not be made to feel like an intruder in it any longer." Marguerite stared at her, her mouth opening and closing. She seemed to realize, for the first time, that the quiet, invisible woman she had dismissed for months was not as weak as she had assumed. "You should leave," Alara said. "Go back to your family, find your own life, your own purpose. Stop living in the shadow of a ghost." For a long moment, Marguerite did not move. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the library. Alara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling, but her heart was steady. She had found her voice, and she would not lose it again. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow melting into mud before the first green shoots began to appear. The estate came alive with the sounds of birdsong and new lambs, and the distant laughter of children freed from winter's confinement. Alara stood at the window of her sitting room, watching the gardens come back to life. So much had changed in the past months. She had changed. She was no longer the timid girl who had arrived at Thornwood Hall with nothing but hope and a desperate need to be loved. She had found purpose, she had found strength, she had found herself. And somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing, she had also found her way back to Alexander. It had not been a dramatic moment of revelation. There had been no grand declaration, no sweeping gesture. Instead, there had been 100 small moments, a shared smile over breakfast, a quiet conversation by the fire, the warmth of his hand on her back as they walked through the village. He had not said the words yet. Neither had she. But they were building something new, something that had not existed before. Not the desperate love of a young bride trying to earn her husband's affection. Not the distant tolerance of a grieving man. Something quieter, something deeper. Something real. The confession, when it came, was not what Alara had expected. It happened on an evening in late April, when the air was soft with the scent of blooming flowers. She and Alexander had spent the day visiting a tenant family whose barn had burned down. They had worked side by side, organizing supplies and comforting the family and making plans for rebuilding. Now they sat together on a stone bench in the garden, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose and deep purple. The world was quiet and still. "I was wrong," Alexander said suddenly. Alara turned to look at him. His profile was sharp against the fading light, his expression distant. "About what?" "About love." He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I thought it was something that happened once, something that could never be replaced. I thought that because I had loved Cecily, I could never love again." He turned to face her, his gray eyes holding hers. "But I was wrong. Love is not a finite thing. It grows and changes and takes new forms. And what I feel for you," he paused, his voice rough, "what I feel for you is different from what I felt for her, but it is no less real, no less deep." Alara's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "I love you, Alara." The words fell from his lips like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying. "I think I have loved you for longer than I knew, but I was too afraid to admit it, too afraid of losing someone again." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you since the day I married you, even when it hurt, even when I thought you would never love me back." Alexander reached for her hand. His fingers were warm and steady, wrapping around hers as though he would never let go. "I do not deserve you," he said, "but I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of you." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The last rays of sunlight faded, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They sat together in the quiet garden, two people who had found their way through pain and distance and regret. Two people who had learned that love was not about perfection or grand gestures or fairy tale promises. It was about showing up, day after day, choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The weeks that followed were the happiest Alara had ever known. Alexander did not become a different man overnight. He was still reserved, still prone to long silences, still carrying the weight of his past. But he was present in a way he had never been before. He sought her out. He listened to her. He laughed with her. And slowly, tentatively, they began to build a marriage. It was not always easy. There were still moments of awkwardness, still echoes of old hurts. But they faced them together, learning to speak honestly about their fears and their hopes. Alara continued her work with the tenants, and Alexander joined her more and more often. Together, they improved the living conditions on the estate, building new cottages and establishing a school and creating a fund to help families in times of crisis. The tenants, who had once pitied the invisible Duchess, now spoke of her with genuine affection. She had become the heart of Thornwood, the bridge between the great house and the people who depended on it. And Alexander watched her with a quiet pride that made her heart swell. One evening, as summer began to paint the gardens in brilliant colors, Alara stood on the terrace and looked out over the estate that had become her home. So much had changed. She was no longer the girl who had stood outside the dining room door, her heart breaking at the sound of cruel words. She was no longer the invisible wife, waiting for a love that would never come. She was no longer a replacement for a ghost. She was Alara Ashworth, Duchess of Thornwood, and she was exactly where she belonged. Alexander appeared beside her, his presence familiar and comforting. He did not speak. He simply stood with her, his shoulder brushing hers, his silence a form of companionship. She reached for his hand. He took it. And together, they watched the sun set over the estate, painting the world in shades of gold. The future stretched before them, uncertain and unknown. But for the first time in her life, Alara was not afraid. She had found her voice, she had found her purpose, she had found her love. And she would never let it go. Months passed, and the rhythm of life at Thornwood Hall settled into something warm and steady. The estate flourished under the combined care of the Duke and Duchess. The tenants prospered, the gardens bloomed, and in the great house, laughter became a common sound. Marguerite had departed in early spring, returning to her family's estate with a quiet dignity that surprised everyone. Before she left, she had sought Alara out and offered a stiff but genuine apology. Alara had accepted it with grace. She understood now that Marguerite had been grieving too, clinging to her sister's memory in the only way she knew how. "I hope you find peace," Alara had told her, "and I hope you find your own love, not a shadow of someone else." Marguerite had nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and then she was gone. The house felt lighter without her. The ghost of Lady Cecily, which had haunted Thornwood for so long, began to fade. Not because she was forgotten. Alexander still spoke of her sometimes, with a gentle fondness that no longer held pain, but because the living had finally begun to claim their space. Alara and Alexander grew closer with each passing day. They learned each other's habits and preferences. They discovered shared interests, a love of old poetry, a fascination with the stars, a quiet pleasure in early morning walks. They argued occasionally, as all couples do, but their arguments were no longer battles. They were conversations, sometimes heated, always honest. And at night, they no longer slept in separate rooms. The distance that had once stretched between them like an ocean had shrunk to nothing. They were partners now, equals, two people who had found their way to each other through a wilderness of pain and misunderstanding. One evening, as autumn began to touch the leaves with gold, Alara sat in the library with a letter in her hand. It was from Thomas Hayward, who had left Thornwood the previous month to take a position at a hospital in London. She read the letter with a smile. "Dear Your Grace, I hope this letter finds you well. London is noisy and crowded and nothing at all like the quiet beauty of Thornwood, but the work is good, and I am learning a great deal. I think often of our walks through the snow and the families we helped together. You taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with kindness. I will carry that lesson with me always. Give my regards to His Grace. He is a fortunate man, though I suspect he already knows that. Yours in friendship, Thomas Hayward." Alara folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. She would write back to him, of course. She would tell him about the new school they were building and the harvest festival being planned. She would wish him well in his new life. But for now, she simply sat in the quiet library, listening to the crackle of the fire, and marveled at how much her life had changed. She had arrived at Thornwood Hall as a girl, full of desperate hope and secret fear. She had become a woman here, strong, purposeful, loved. And she was grateful for the pain that had taught her resilience, for the distance that had taught her independence, for the love that had come, slow and unexpected, when she had finally stopped chasing it. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly disheveled, his cravat loosened. He had been working with the steward all afternoon, reviewing accounts and planning for the winter. "I missed you," he said simply. She smiled and held out her hand. He crossed the room and took it, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "I was right here," she teased. "I know," he pressed a kiss to her forehead, "but I missed you anyway." She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, wool and wood smoke and something indefinably him. She had spent so long feeling alone in this house. Now she could not imagine ever feeling that way again. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." His voice was rough with emotion, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. They stood together in the firelight, holding each other, while the autumn wind rattled the windows and the old house settled around them. Outside, the world was changing. Seasons would turn, years would pass, challenges would come and go. But inside this room, inside this moment, there was only peace. And love. And the quiet, steady promise of forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.